It is one of the great ironies of the American calendar that our high holy day of consumer capitalism follows directly after the one day devoted to gratitude. People stand in lines that wrap around department stores waiting to rush in to buy things just hours after saying how thankful they are for all the things they already have. And to make matters worse, Black Friday now begins in many places on Thanksgiving Day. So before your turkey is even fully digested, you're excusing yourself from the table to go swipe your credit card. Our love of buying things is part and parcel of our general cultural obsession with acquisition. We have an insatiable hunger for newer, bigger, and generally speaking, more. We want a newer model of the things we already have that still work. We want a bigger house with a bigger kitchen. And above all, we want more money. How much? We don't know, just more. And while we may have honed this hunger for more to perfection in the modern West, it's certainly not new. As long as humans have had neighbors, they've been coveting what they didn't have. The Bible speaks at length about this, and so did the Church Fathers. In fact, after years of reading the Church Fathers, both on my own and in my Patreon book club, to this day, the most challenging, the most convicting text I've read is a compilation of St. Basil's work on wealth and poverty titled On Social Justice. Today, I want to allow St. Basil to speak prophetically to all of us. And believe me, this is a video where I'm preaching to myself. If you're not familiar with St. Basil, allow me to briefly introduce him to you. He was born in Caesarea around 330 AD to a family rich in spiritual and material wealth. His grandmother, his father, and his mother all became saints, as did 4 of his 9 brothers and sisters. Talk about a family legacy. As for material wealth, his father was a well-respected lawyer and part of the Roman aristocracy. This afforded Basil a privileged upbringing, including a top-class education, which can be seen in his writings. However, throughout his life, Basil's relationship to material wealth would change considerably. First, after his university studies, Basil experienced a profound spiritual conversion while reading the Gospels, and he was convinced that the path to spiritual perfection was found in selling one's goods and giving the proceeds to the poor. This led to his baptism, renunciation of wealth, and him moving into a monastery. Now, if Basil's story ended there, it would be a familiar one. I mean, the Christian tradition is replete with riches to rags stories in which rich young men sell all they have and move to a monastery. That's not to say it wouldn't be a story worthy of great praise, but it would be less unique. Basil's path had another twist, though. 6 years after going to the monastery, he felt called to help a world torn apart by theological and socioeconomic divisions. So he left the peaceful world of the monastery for the turbulent world of the Aryan crisis and urban poverty. Now, people who watch this channel may know Basil as a great champion of Nicene orthodoxy, and he was that. But that's not all. He's also remembered for forming the Basiliad, a philanthropic endeavor many have dubbed as the first ever hospital. Basil wanted to bring the monastic life to the city, and he wanted to place care for the poor and diseased at the heart of the Christian life. Gregory of Nazianzus described the Basiliad in these words at St. Basil's funeral. "Go forth a little way from the city, and behold the new city, the storehouse of piety, the common treasury of the wealth, where disease is regarded in a religious light, and disaster is thought a blessing, and sympathy is put to the test." In the Basiliad, Basil and other priests lived alongside the poor and the dying, creating a new community focused on the 2 great commandments, loving God and loving one's neighbor. There's a famous saying that's often attributed to St. Francis of Assisi: preach the gospel, use words if necessary. The idea is that one's life should, all on its own, convey the message of Christ. And there's a lot to commend in this saying. Certainly St. Basil's life, all on its own, does a marvelous job of preaching the gospel without words. However, without the words, we risk holding Basil up as this distant hero to be admired, rather than a prophet whose life and witness is a rebuke to us. His words make clear that caring for the poor isn't just a nice thing to do, it's a necessary thing to do. And that's not all. Basil doesn't just extol the virtue of charity. He calls us to reimagine the socioeconomic order entirely in pursuit of greater justice. The best way into his teaching on wealth, poverty, and social justice is to look at his approach to Jesus' famous words to the rich young ruler, In Matthew 19 and elsewhere in the Synoptics, we find a man asking Jesus what he must do to inherit eternal life. First, Jesus tells him to follow the commandments, including loving your neighbor as yourself. When the man asks what else he must do, Jesus tells him, "If you would be perfect, go, sell what you possess and give to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven, and come, follow me." C. Paul Schroeder, translator of On Social Justice, writes in his wonderful introduction to that work that at that time there were two main schools of interpretation regarding this passage. First, we have Clement of Alexandria's approach, which was to say that this passage was not fundamentally about actually giving your money away. It was about spiritual attachment to money. This tradition is still prominent today, and you encounter it when you hear people saying things like, "It's not money that's the problem. It's the love of money that's the problem." The second approach to this passage was the monastic interpretation. This was the school of thought that said, no, this really is about giving away all your possessions, but there was a catch. This interpretation gave way to a two-tiered system. The perfect, the spiritually elite, in this case the monks, were called to give up everything. But those in the world were, well, to a greater or lesser extent, kind of off the hook. St. Basil came along and offered a third approach. For him, this passage was about material possessions, but it applied to everyone. And that's what makes St. Basil's teaching so radical. The logic of St. Basil's teaching is that Jesus is connecting giving away one's possessions to loving one's neighbor. In other words, giving away possessions isn't an additional commandment. It's an explanation of what loving one's neighbor looks like in practice. And this isn't just like coughing up $1 to hand over to the homeless man on the street. It's far more than that. St. Basil concludes, thus, those who love their neighbor as themselves possess nothing more than their neighbor. He goes on, for the more you abound in wealth, the more you lack in love. Why is that, you might ask? Well, for Basil, to have more than your neighbor is to steal from your neighbor. The goods of this world belong to all people, and to hoard for yourself is to take directly from those in need. He writes, it is as if someone were to take the first seat in the theater, then bar everyone else from attending, so that one person alone enjoys what is offered for the benefit of all in common. This is what the rich do. He goes on, they seize common goods before others have the opportunity, then claim them as their own by right of preemption. In other words, if you're taking more than you need, you are taking things that belong to other people. But here's the alternative social vision that he offers. For if we all took only what was necessary to satisfy our own needs, giving the rest to those who lack, no one would be rich, no one would be poor, and no one would be in need. In case that wasn't enough, he goes on to say, the bread you are holding back is for the hungry. The clothes you keep put away are for the naked. The shoes that are rotting away with disuse are for those who have none. The silver you keep buried in the earth is for the needy. You are thus guilty of injustice toward as many as you might have aided and did not. I don't know about you, but St. Basil's words land as a sucker punch for me, especially because he leaves no room for escape. He recognizes that we're all prone to expand our needs to our income. The more we make, the more we adjust our lifestyle and put more and more things in the category of needs. And look, I know I'm guilty of this. I think back to when Eliza and I were first married. She was still in college and I was making about $30,000 a year. We had very little money, and yet we didn't feel poor. Our second floor walk-up apartment with mismatched Facebook Marketplace furniture felt like a castle to us. We didn't know to want more than we had. Then when she graduated and we had two incomes, we moved to a new area and rent was higher and our expenses went up. In time, we'd start making more and we chased the American dream, buying a house. As many people can relate, you eventually find yourself making more than you ever have, but feeling like you have less than ever before. When all the Doge craziness happened when I was still working for the federal government and I made the switch to doing this full time, we saw our income pretty much cut in half, but our mortgage stayed the same. And yet, in that experience, we've learned that God does provide and that we need far less than we think. We've learned to hold things more loosely. But I'll be honest, we are still miles off of St. Basil's vision. St. Basil still reads like a sucker punch for me. I still know, even when things are tight, we're immensely blessed. And look, even in saying that, I hear how we've subtly transformed the Christian vision. We've been taught that having more than enough is a blessing. St. Basil would not think that way. He would say, to the extent that we have more than the poor around us, we are cursed, not blessed. We are calling judgment upon ourselves. And look, if I'm being really transparent, even after sitting with and wrestling with St. Basil's words for over a year, I still don't fully know what to do with them. I feel like Kierkegaard in his assessment of Abraham in Fear and Trembling. He says that he could admire Abraham, but he knew he'd be lying if he said he fully understood Abraham or that he could walk in his footsteps. And look, I'd love, at this point in the video, to give you a 3-point application for living out St. Basil's vision. And sure, I could say, go through your stuff and donate some excess. And that would be great. You should do that. We all should. But, that would just be window dressing. St. Basil isn't calling for some seasonal charity. He's calling for us to turn our socioeconomic world on its head, to see wealth not as something to strive for, but something to avoid. He's seeing inequality not as a sad fact of life, but as something that is fundamentally our fault. I don't want to tame the message of St. Basil. I want to allow its full force to come through. But I also don't want to pretend like I've attained the perfection St. Basil speaks of. Not even close. I sit under his condemnation. I filmed this video in the comfort of a house with an extra room on the other side of that wall while people in my community go homeless. I have more than one jacket when many have none. I have money in savings when people cannot afford to heat their homes this winter. St. Basil, in his most famous sermon, calls us to tear down our barns, to do away with our savings for a rainy day because it's already raining on so many right now. I try to take steps in this direction, but I'm constantly aware that the horizon toward which he beckons us seems ever so far away. And look, I don't say any of this in an attempt to shame people. I know that right now, many people are struggling. Costs of living continue to rise, and wages rarely keep up. Economic uncertainty abounds, and I'm not trying to add insult to injury. I know things are hard. Believe me, we just went through a month in which Eliza, who works for the federal government, was not getting paid. I get it. And I also know that, according to St. Basil, we are far too often blind to the suffering around us by focusing on what we think we need. I've got no easy answers for you. I really only have his words to share. And it's my prayer that we're all challenged and convicted by this man who took Jesus' call to love our neighbors so seriously, who dared to dream of a world order that looked more just and more compassionate and more equitable. And look, there are so many challenges that face the church today. But how we care for the poor and deal with the inequality among us must not be one we forget. We can't use the excuse of not being able to reach St. Basil's full vision of this as an excuse to not start walking in that direction. I don't know what that looks like for you. I can't pretend to know what your life involves and all the intricacies and the difference between St. Basil's time and our time and how we think about the role of wealth and all of that. Look, I know it's complicated. But I also think sometimes we use complication as an excuse. We say, because we don't fully know how to do this, well, we don't have to do it at all. And I think that's an excuse. I think it's an excuse I use. And yeah, I don't have the answers, but I know that right now there are people who are suffering. And I know that Christ is close to the poor. That's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for the rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. And that we really like to pretend like that eye of the needle is a lot bigger rather than shrinking our camels. We like to turn a blind eye and assume that those who are poor for their own fault, and that's not our problem. But it is. And we like to think we can love our neighbor while being blind to their sufferings, but we can't. And that suffering has to do with wealth and poverty. and we don't get to keep our bank accounts in a separate sphere from our spiritual lives. I'll say it one more time. I don't have all the answers. But I do think that St. Basil is calling us in the right direction.